Well, as far as my position, I think that I think everybody here is going to agree that since 1965, we've had real problems with diversity as far as we've had far too much of it, and that the current mixture of people is going in the wrong direction. But I would also argue that there are benefits to diversity that we have enjoyed and do still enjoy as Americans that we never would have created or never did create in the ethno-states that we came from. And so a lot of that diversity is what's allowed the United States to have a broad global appeal, where, you know, people watch anywhere you go in the world, people watch American shows, listen to American music, enjoy American culture all over the world, everywhere. But nobody does that for like Polish folk music. The only people who like that are Poles. Does that make sense? So like, because we were so diverse and brought so many people together, we were able to create a global culture, which is what makes us, or much of what makes us so rich and powerful and influential in the world today. And that's my valid thought.
Okay. Greg, do you want to give a first statement here?
Well, I just want to respond to the initial statement. I don't think that I'm not particularly proud of the popular culture that America exports to the world. I think it's mostly trash. I think it's mostly decadent. And I don't think that that's a very good argument for diversity. In fact, I think that's an argument against diversity. I would much rather listen to authentic European folk music than basically the products of the American pop culture industry. So I just think that this argument, this debate is off to a very, very dead start. I think it's sort of stillborn if that's really the best argument that can be made for multiculturalism. In my opinion, multiculturalism for America is a bad idea. And it's a bad idea in America for the same reason as it's a bad idea anywhere else in the world. Multiculturalism is a source of conflict. It's a source of conflict and tension. And no serious political thinker throughout the entire history of the West has ever believed that racial or ethnic diversity within the same political order has been a source of strength. It's always been regarded as a fault line along which a polity can fracture. And to the extent that any kind of diversity was ever allowed, it was always allowed under the condition that either one group would be entirely subordinate to another group, or new groups would be assimilated and lose their distinct identities, and therefore diversity would come to an end. I don't like the idea of cultural genocide against other groups as a condition for them to be part of our polity. And I don't like the idea of simply dominating and subordinating other groups as a condition for them being within our political system. And so I think that the most equitable and honorable form of government does not require either cultural domination or cultural genocide against different groups. Instead, what we need to do is we need to have separate societies for racially and ethnically distinct peoples. Ethno-nationalism, broadly defined, is simply the idea that the best political order for reducing conflict between groups, which is one of the great causes of sorrow in the world, and also for creating conditions of independent, divergent evolution, cultural evolution, that the best conditions for that are established by separate societies for distinct peoples. And white nationalism, as I define it, is simply ethno-nationalism for white people. White nationalism is not the idea that a generic European man needs a generic European state, because there is no such thing as a generic white person. All white people have a particular culture, a particular ethnicity, and therefore what white nationalism means is ethnic self-determination for all white peoples who aspire to basically having control over their own destinies. And I add that proviso at the end, for those who aspire to autonomy, because some groups don't. Some groups, for instance, the different ethnic groups in Switzerland seem to be getting along fine in the Swiss Federation. I think largely because they have a great deal of local autonomy. Where you have groups that don't get along in the same political system, such as the Flemish and the Wallonian people in Belgium, the best solution is probably for them to have separate states. The best solution for the Czech and Slovak incompatibility basically was for them to have separate states, and now they get along really quite well. So I think the tendency in politics today is really a conflict between globalizing institutions and ideologies and ethnic nationalism. And I stand for ethnic nationalism, for secessionism, against every form of imperialism and every form of cultural genocide or cultural assimilation. And the United States was initially founded and conceived as a white nation. There were non-whites on our soil, Blacks and American Indians at first, later Chinese, but they were never considered part of the American polity. They were not considered people who could be citizens of the American polity until after the Civil War, until after the 14th Amendment in 1868, when native-born Blacks and also American Indians who didn't reside on reservations could become citizens of the United States. So this country went for a very long time with an explicitly racial definition of citizenship. And right up until 1965, we had immigration and naturalization laws in place designed to maintain a white supermajority based on the ethnic percentages of the 1890 census. That is within the lifetime of many people alive today, of many people who are listening to this discussion. And we've been robbed of a birthright of a normatively white America. And I say normatively white as opposed to just simply homogeneously white, because obviously there have been non-whites on our soil ever since the beginning, but the country was conceived of as a culturally, normatively European society. And we tried to maintain a European supermajority, and that was really considered part of the birthright bequeathed to all Americans by the founders. And we have been robbed of that birthright. And as I conceive white nationalism in America today, it is an attempt to recover that birthright and to create an America that is ethnically and normatively and ultimately demographically entirely white. And the way that that can happen is by repatriating non-white immigrant groups. I would say all post-1965 immigration could be reversed over time, and hiving off certain territories for other groups that exist here. So, for instance, returning to the reservation system for American Indians, giving them maximal autonomy, creating maybe a Black state called Wakanda somewhere on this continent, things like that. That's how I envision white nationalism coming to completion in the United States. I don't think we were ever meant to be a multicultural, multiracial society. I think that race and ethnic differences have always been a source of conflict and weakness in America. We dealt with the ethnic differences between white groups by forced assimilation, by cultural genocide, if you will. And we cannot, though, assimilate non-whites. They are unassimilable without basically destroying our genetic distinctness as a race. And we cannot, that's too high a price to pay. So that's my basic, simple case for why I don't believe in a multicultural America. It was never meant to be a multicultural, multiracial society. And multicultural, multiracial societies don't work very well. And there's one other factor that should be thrown in here, and that is that in today's multicultural, multiracial order, whites basically are on the road to extinction. We are penalized for any form of white identity and white pride, except for taking responsibility for the failures of other groups. Right? We can be white for the purposes of blame, but never for the purposes of pride. And our birth rates are lower than non-white groups coming in. We are basically playing a game that is stacked against us, systematically stacked against us. So every time we have an interaction with a non-white group, they get to play the race card. They get to appeal to ethnic pride. They get to use ethnic nepotism, and we don't. And we might have most of the chips at the beginning of that game, and we certainly did. But if we play by those rules and continue to play by those rules, we will have nothing left. And we are also being demographically displaced. We are being outbred in our own homeland. And if these trends are not interrupted, basically, there's nothing to prevent whites from ceasing to exist as a distinct race. And I think that that would be a terrible tragedy. I want our kind to continue on into the future. That is a simple, natural, normal animal instinct to want your kind to perpetuate itself. And that's really what the Constitution was envisioned as, creating a just, free, liberal sort of society in which the posterity of the founders would perpetuate itself. And the posterity of the founders also would include people that they thought were worthy of joining the polity. And in 1790, they defined those people as free white people of good character.
Is that a good opening statement?
So, valid thought.
Yes.
First
off, do you mind if I smoke on stream or no?
Oh, that's
cigarettes.
I don't have to smell it, so I'm okay.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. Is it your position that somehow white people specifically would benefit from multiculturalism?
It's my position that we have benefited from multiculturalism, and I'll explain that a little bit, right? And it's really clear to see just in our general society, to me, in that, for example, and I would say not just white people. I would say that all people have benefited from multiculturalism and the experiment that is the United States. So an example that I use is basketball, right? So initially, the American Indians, or whatever you want to call them, natives, whatever, they had a game that was similar to basketball. White people came over, saw that game, changed that game a little bit, turns it into a professional sport. Then black people came into the sport and turns it into a much more athletic event and changed the game altogether, right? And now, because of all those ethnicities putting their little point in, or whatever, they're pitching in to the sport. Now basketball is a global game that's played in 100 countries around the world, and blah, 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 blah. The same can be said about jazz, where blacks didn't have access to European instruments. Then they got them and created a new art form, which is jazz. Out of that gets rock and roll. You don't get rock and roll without jazz. You don't get pop music without rock and roll, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You see what I'm saying? Like, it all tumbles from one thing to the next. So George Washington Carver comes up with peanut butter, and then peanut butter and jelly sandwiches become an integral part of the suburban white experience, right? So things just build off each other. And I would say that a lot of the conflicts that we face with diversity are also one of the reasons that we've created so many innovations. So, for example, and this is going to be a bad example, right? But I don't think that our policing systems and strategies would be as advanced as they are if we didn't have high crime communities. So like so if you didn't have black communities, you wouldn't have cops as well trained and as proficient as they are, right? So because you have certain challenges, you're able to then overcome them with new inventions, new discoveries that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. And I think that's evident in that places like Poland and Chechnya and Russia and, wherever, all these European countries that have forever been ethno-states until the last 20, 25 years, they didn't do anything to the extent that what the United States has done. So that's what I would say to that. So, and if you say that the culture is terrible, the United States culture is terrible, it's like, okay, well, there are aspects of our culture that are bad. And there are aspects of our culture that I think are harmful and blah, 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 blah. But other people think that those aspects are great. So, different strokes for different folks. Some people think that, drawing art is dumb. Some people think photography is dumb. Some people think that, classical music is dumb. And other people think that, rap is the highest art form there is. So, there's differences of opinion, but all of these things have come out of and have been born of a uniquely American experience where they weren't created anywhere else. I didn't see the Dutch inventing a lot of this stuff that has come up in the United States. And I think the unique challenges that we've faced, in part because of our diversity, have made it such that we've had additional obstacles to overcome, which means we're able to create more. So, both artistically and technologically.
I guess.
Well, I don't dispute that we have better prisons and better policing because we have to incarcerate and police large numbers of restless, crime-prone brown people. I don't really consider that to be a benefit to civilization. To be honest.
I would also argue that the only reason you're able to have a conservative movement is because you have such a broad range of people. So in places like Europe that are more ethno-state type places, you have a lot more socialism because you have people who have all a relatively similar IQ, right? So the guy who's making $100 million a year has a 120 IQ, and the guy who's cleaning his toilet has a 108, right? Whereas in this country, you have a much greater disparity. So you're able to have a more diverse economy with less resentment. Resentment in the polls, at least, as far as, we don't live in a socialist society. A lot of the reason we have a lot of the conservative and libertarian ideals is specifically because a lot of white people don't want to pay the benefits for black people. But if those black people weren't there, a lot of those white people would vote for more benefits for themselves, as is shown in Europe and Russia and everywhere else that's been a white ethno-state forever.
Well, I don't have any problem with homogeneous white societies with large welfare states, so I just don't think that is a really important consideration.
How is that not?
There's a book that
you're okay with socialism as long as it's white socialism.
Yeah, definitely. Socialism for white people is fine.
Now, that's a terrible idea.
Somebody needs to write a book about black invention myths, and the title should be "Not Even Peanut Butter," because not even peanut butter was invented by a black man. But
I mean, it's ground up peanut butter. Who cares, right?
Yeah, well, but they obviously care if it's trotted out all the time as a black.
I just used it as a springboard. I'm just saying they build on each other.
Well, let me just back up and say that the advantages that you're citing of multiculturalism are actually not advantages to living in a multicultural society or a multiracial society. What they are is it's a list of advantages that accrue to living in a multicultural, multiracial planet rather than a multicultural, multiracial society. And let me explain this to you. For instance, you might say that rock and roll and jazz were products of American multiculturalism. However, I know people who live in Norway and Sweden who enjoy rock and roll and jazz, and they are not enjoying them because they have a large population of blacks.
They didn't come up with it.
Yeah. The point is that you can enjoy the products of other cultures without having to live with those people.
But no,
we can enjoy, let's just say that you like rap music. I'm not going to pass any judgments on this. Let's just say
I'm not a fan, but okay. But yeah, let's say.
Do you need to live in the same society or even the same neighborhood as the people who produce that music?
Of course not. Of course not.
Okay, great. So boundaries between where people live and the kinds of things that they enjoy are not, that maybe cross those boundaries. It's not incompatible to have barriers between yourself and other people's and still enjoy the products of those other people.
But you're pretending that these things just exist in a static environment. These things were created because of the mixture of peoples. It's not like
Okay.
just jazz
Let-
existed and
let
we're
me
like,
just-
oh, we found it. It's
Yeah.
like, no, they
Yeah.
were exposed to European things and they were in a French quarter, so they had blah, 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 blah.
Right.
And over time, you develop jazz.
Let's just put that in brackets for a second, because I do not think that because some people like rock and roll or jazz, which is a indulgence, it's
Sure,
a
yeah.
pleasurable thing.
But it's a
that
cultural,
that's-
it's a major cultural touchstone, isn't it?
Yeah, sure. Okay, it's a major cultural touchstone. I'm going to write a whole revisionist history of rock and jazz someday, because I'm very, very tired of the Afro-American centered narrative for creating rock and roll and jazz. I think a lot of it's false. But let's just set that aside. Let's just pretend that it's real. Is that a legitimate price? Is that such a huge boon to civilization that we should accept a situation where enormous amounts of crime are committed by blacks in America? Because most blacks in America aren't Duke Ellington, right? Does the fact that Duke Ellington lived mean that X number of white people every year must die, or X number of white women every year must be raped because blacks get a free pass to be on our soil in America? I don't think that's a very valid argument. Thomas Sowell lived, so
that's not
white
what I'm
race
saying.
must die.
I'm not arguing that, in order to have rock and roll, we should permit rape. That's just an obfuscation of what I'm saying. What I'm trying to say is that the difficulties that arise also present opportunities that we have sometimes been able to seize upon and create greater things out of.
The rape crisis in South Africa has created devices.
There are rape whistles being sold in South Africa.
You see, it's wonderful. It's progress in civilization.
Somebody's making money.
Yeah, exactly. It's like breaking a window to stimulate the economy. I'm sorry, but that's not a valid consideration to me.
Hold on,
the fact
wait
that
a
we
second.
live in a society where
you can make the same argument about every group, though.
Hey, look.
Hey, valid thought. You're interrupting a lot. Just let him finish.
I mean, the fact that we might live in a society where private security companies and pawnbrokers are doing great business does not mean that we're living in a just and orderly and desirable society. So I just don't think that cleaning up the problems created by non-whites in America and having to overcome those obstacles is a good argument for having those people around. I would much rather we have large areas of our economy that are basically dedicated to cleaning up the problems created by diversity and multiculturalism in immigration. I'd much rather have all that money go to opera houses, better education, the space program, and things that really do add value to human life. I would much rather have more art museums and fewer black shanty towns and ghettos and fewer prisons filled with black people, for instance. I think that would be a better way of spending those resources.